Welcome to this week's edition of Church Chat. Thank you for being with us. Our vague assignment this week was to reflect on chapter 21 of John's Gospel, obviously because it comes right after the resurrection story, the Easter story. And I can't say that I was overly moved this week by it, but one thing that intrigued me is how many times fish have to do with what Jesus is doing. In the scripture we used in worship on Easter, it mentioned Jesus appearing to the disciples and his followers, and one of the things he did to prove that he was not a ghost was to eat some fish. And here in John's Gospel, it's a similar sort of thing. Jesus shows up at the seashore and calls out to the fishermen, "Have you any fish?" And they're like, "No, we're out of luck." And then he tells them a particular place to fish, and they come in with 153 fish. Pretty particular number. I did a little looking into that, and there's various opinions about what 153 means. Jerome, way back in the 2nd century, said that the Greek intellectuals had identified 153 different species of fish, and so the implication being that they caught all the different types of fish and that the gospel was to be shared with all kinds of different people. Augustine said that 153 was the sum of all the numbers from 1 to 17. If you had 1 plus 2 plus 3, adds up to 153, for whatever significance that has. But the thing that struck me is that this story after the resurrection is a reflection of how the original disciples were called. And strangely not in John's Gospel, but in Matthew's Gospel. This was the same fishing miracle. Jesus tells them where to fish. They bring in more than they can accommodate, and then after that he calls them and says, "Come follow me, come be fishers of men, come be my disciples." And so Peter and Andrew, James and John all go and follow Jesus. Here it is the sign where they all begin to recognize that it is the resurrected Jesus, and in turn he has work for them to do. Again, being more than disciples, being apostles, and going out and carrying the message to all the world. So the fish in the story are central. Just like the feeding of the 5,000, the fish have to do with that. And it is part of Jesus' identity as being the fish and fishing and having fishermen, with one of the early signs of the church being a fish. So I guess as we go through the Easter story, we are to go out and be fishermen, to share the story of Jesus and to fish for other believers. So we'll see what Randy and Lynn have come up with this vague assignment, and hope you glean something. Hope you find something to catch today in this fishing lesson.
As usual, Sid and I must be using some of the same resources. I don't know, but I found the same explanation of the 153 fish from the same two ancient experts. I also was puzzled by the fishing was happening on the Sea of Tiberias, and I could not find a Sea of Tiberias anywhere. And it took me a long time to figure out that that's another way of saying the Sea of Galilee. But the thing that came to me was not there was one other thing that came from research. In the Abingdon Bible commentary that I was looking at, there is some suspicion that this last chapter of John was an addendum, possibly by another author, and they had all kinds of technical reasons from the word usage and stuff that they thought it might be somebody else. And that might explain why the same story is told about Jesus on the seashore telling them where to let down their nets and stuff, if it was somebody else trying to sum it all up. And that had something to do with the disciple Jesus loved and wanting to lend some credence to the disciple that Jesus loved, being John. But aside from looking at what everybody else thought, when I was thinking about it, it just came to me that this is kind of a living parable for us. The disciples weren't, at that point they were acting as fishermen. They hadn't figured out yet what they were going to do now that Jesus had been crucified, and so they were acting as fishermen, and they were not doing a good job. It wasn't working out well. They caught nothing all night, and then this very familiar man that they weren't ready to admit yet was Jesus, told them to let down the nets on the right side of the boat, and they caught these 153 large fish, and the nets didn't break. And in my reading, they spend half their time mending nets because they just break easily, and this huge load didn't break them. And I started thinking that they were not having any luck or any success in their job until they followed the directions of Jesus and let their nets down where he told them to. And perhaps sometimes when we wonder why we're not growing in this church, any church, it's not just us, but maybe we need to figure a way to figure out what our mission really is, what it is that Jesus wants in this place at this time. And maybe we would be more successful.
So pretty cool coincidence that I wanted to share was that last church chat we talked about the end of this story and Jesus asking Peter if he loved him. On Easter Sunday, our scripture for devotions class was John chapter 21 verse 7, where the disciples are in the boat and they call out that it's the Lord, and Peter grabs his garment, jumps in the water, and swims towards the shore, towards Jesus. And then, of course, today we're talking about wrapping it all up. So I thought that was pretty cool. In the devotions, it started off with asking a question. Have you ever been in a crisis where you have abandoned everything, where you've surrendered both externally and internally? And to prod the conversation, I mentioned that there are many ways that we can abandon. We can throw our hands in the air and say, I'm done with this, I quit, and walk away. Or we can go to God and say, I've broken something that I can't fix and I need help. And I think that that's where Peter was in this story. He knew he had done wrong in denying Christ. He could no longer take the words back any more than he could take the bullet back out of the chamber once the trigger's been pulled. He couldn't fix it. And so he went straight to Jesus out of the boat. And in my mind, I think maybe he was trying to make amends. The other part of the story that, for whatever reason, this time it caught my attention. It's so subtle that I guess, and so odd of a story that I overlooked it. But Jesus was, again, showing a servant's heart in cooking breakfast for the disciples. In a more profound way, he was providing for them that which would sustain them, would give them strength. And I thought that was interesting. And then the third point I want to make was off of what Pastor Sid had mentioned last week, but also again today, about Jesus having a job for them. And I thought back to the Jesus asking Peter, do you love me? And it struck me, he didn't say, "Did you love me?" He said, "Do you love me?" So in other words, he was trying to pull Peter out of the past. Don't live in your past failures. Don't live in your past mistakes. I have something for you in front of you. And it also made me think, though, that oftentimes we do the same thing. We can't get past our past mistakes, our past failures, and it keeps us from growing. But at the same time, sometimes we're also guilty of living in our past triumphs, our past victories, our past glories. And we fail to see that there may be better things in front of us. Life, the seasons of life always change. And if we're constantly living in the past, whether good or bad, it might prevent us from seeing that which is really wonderful right in front of us.
Years ago, I used to religiously follow the liturgical calendar, not so much anymore. But this season would be called Eastertide, those few weeks after Easter and before Pentecost, when we're still living in the resurrection. So I hope that Randy and Lynn's and my comments gave you a little something to think about during Eastertide, during this time when we are trying to live out the resurrection and reflect on that reality's meaning for each one of us. Again, if you want to read this scripture, it's John chapter 21, and you can see all that we were talking about and reflecting upon. We won't be here next week because I'll be out of town at a meeting, but we'll return the following week, and I hope that you will join us. I hope that you do live out the resurrection and that Christ will be with you during this Easter season.